Well, the Veterans Committee made their Hall of Fame announcement, and once again, I got denied. But it's a good time to be a crime dog. It's a good time to be Tom Amansky, but not a great time to be a Met fan. We're talking all about it in a Locked On Diamondbacks, Locked On MLB crossover. Let's hit it.
You are Locked On MLB. Your daily MLB podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
It's me. Hello, baseball fans. Welcome to the Locked On MLB, Locked On Diamondbacks crossover. That's my dog, and I'm your host, Paul Francis Sullivan. Please call me Sully. Every week, I, the host, who am a former television producer, got an Emmy nomination for my troubles. I've been a baseball podcaster for the last 10 years, and once a week, I open the door and I invite in my co-host for the show, which is this guy right here. His name is...
I'm Sully's dog, Millard Thomas, host of the Locked On Diamondbacks podcast. You can follow me on Twitter at CreatorThomas24 for my personal account, or look up the show account, Locked On Diamondbacks, both Twitter and Instagram. And please hit subscribe on the Locked On Diamondbacks YouTube channel.
Did I say my name? Did I introduce myself?
I'm not too sure. You said who you were.
I said everything's up my name. I'm Paul Francis Sullivan. Call me Sully. What do you want? You can follow us at Locked On MLB Pods. My dog's going bananas up there, and there's a reason why. We'll get that in a second. Follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter and Instagram. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast on Instagram. My dog is barking. My dog is going crazy. Woof, woof, woofing. And there's only one reason for that. Who do you think my dog's favorite player is?
The crime dog.
The crime dog. Fred McGriff. Do you even understand why he's called the crime dog?
I was listening to MLB Network a little bit. I think it has to do with some old TV show that was way before I was born.
There was a commercial. It was a public service announcement with McGruff, the crime dog, who takes a bite out of crime. And when those ads were going on, Fred McGriff was emerging as a star for Toronto. And so it was one of those nicknames that Chris Berman on ESPN just dubbed him Fred the Crime Dog McGriff. And it's one of those things that Fred McGriff's nickname has lasted longer than the thing that it was based upon. But anyway, there you go, Ellie. Yeah, I know. Fred McGriff got in, long overdue. The what was it? The Contemporary Committee. We're going to start positive first. We're being positive first. The Contemporary Committee had 8 names on the ballot?
Yeah.
And chose Fred McGriff unanimously to join this year's class of the Baseball Hall of Fame. Tell me what you think, because I remember his entire career. Remember when he came up with the Blue Jays? I saw his entire career. His first at bat in the World Series was a home run off of Oral Hershiser. The guy played for several different teams, produced wherever he went, and impossible not to root for him as a player, which I think plays a factor in some of these veteran committee votes. But I think Fred McGriff is a worthy Hall of Famer. Tell me what you think.
Yeah, I'm not going to sit here and act like I watched Fred McGriff's whole career. I was born in 1997. Most of his prime was done by the time I really got into baseball. So I'm not going to sit here and act like I watched the man's whole career. But from what I saw from reading my Wikipedia today, Sully, and looking at Baseball Reference, I definitely thought Fred McGriff was worthy of the Hall of Fame. Ended his career with 10 seasons with at least 30 home runs. He led the MLB in total home run hits from 1989 to 1994. He had the third most home runs in the decade from 1988 to 1997. The two players ahead of him in that decade, Barry Bonds and Mark McGwire. This guy, Fred McGriff, I don't really know much about him, but from looking at the stats, I think he's very worthy of the Hall of Fame. But I would like to know, what was the process that went into the voting for Fred McGriff? Why did the committee decide to vote him in as opposed to the other major league players? Because it seems to be all behind closed doors, very private, and we just don't know exactly what was the process that went into this.
Yeah, before we get into the closed room with cigars, smoking, and everything like that, before we get into all that, I am going to just just be positive first about McGriff's wonderful career. And, the fact that he was, he was just year in and year out a 30 home run hitter. He finished just shy, just agonizingly shy of 500 home runs.
Mm-hmm.
I think he was like 7 home runs shy. And of all those years, he just one extra one here or there. But I remember he was there was a period of time where the Toronto Blue Jays farm system was so outrageously fertile. And the Dodgers and the Blue Jays went all in on the Dominican Republic very early on. And and they brought in a lot of players to there. And McGriff was from Florida, big left-handed power hitter with just a beautiful swing. And here's something I remember about McGriff. I remember being in my apartment in New York in 1995. And McGriff, I was trying to go through which player had the best chance to break 700 home runs. And the name that I came up with was McGriff. Because I remember at that point, Bonds was a skinny dude. McGuire's career had broken down. He was done in 95. And he reemerged a couple of years later and found a fountain of youth that really none of us could have predicted. McGriff was steady. If you want to just make a statement about a player playing it clean, body never changed, production never changed, mechanics were there. McGriff was there. He seemed to be I don't know really any of these guys, but he seemed like a good enough man. People seem to swear by him as a teammate. His arrival with the Atlanta Braves basically sparked one of the great comebacks in the history of baseball. I've heard people try to make the 1993 Giants as a giant choke story. And I refuse to believe any team that won 103 ball games choked down the stretch. And the fact of the matter is that when they acquired Fred McGriff, they played something like 800 ball down the stretch. And he just was the piece to that puzzle. And I also year in and year out, he just was amongst the home run leaders. He led both leagues in home runs, which was rare to do. And I actually have a very distinct memory in my freshman year of college. And this is before the internet and everything like that. You had to pick up the newspaper. Whoa. And USA Today was my go-to newspaper for sports, because they seemed to get stuff earlier than the Times. The Times, New York Times, you had to wait like a month to get a score. And I remember picking up the newspaper and being startled by the trade that Fred McGriff and Tony Fernandez, 2 mainstays of the Toronto Blue Jays, were traded to the San Diego Padres for Joe Carter and Roberto Alomar. Just straight up. That was a baseball card trade, of which, think about that, 2 Hall of Famers were in that trade. And Tony Fernandez, who would look up his career. Tony Fernandez had a spectacular career. And of course, Joe Carter was a solid player, hit one of the greatest home runs in baseball history. So even that trade has even greater stature now, because it's a rare instance of a Hall of Famer being traded for a Hall of Famer. But this one were both at the peak of their careers. I have no problem with this. I have no problem with Fred McGriff's vote. I don't know why he wasn't voted in by the writers. But I have to say, when I was watching the thing on MLB Network and they said, "We have won," I felt like my heart go into my mouth, because I thought, who is it? Is it going to be Bonds? Is it going to be Clemens? I was pretty sure it was going to be McGriff. There was a lot of support for McGriff. But it was also could have been friend of the podcast, Dale Murphy. Could have been Mattingly. And so that one moment they said, like, he played 19 seasons. Okay, that takes away Mattingly. And starting with the Blue Jays, that's all I had to say. McGriff, there you go.
Yeah,
So,
just like reading the tea leaves on Twitter and social media before the voting, it seems like most of the community was behind McGriff. He seemed to have like the most public support of like anyone on the ballot this year. And I
yeah.
know people, when we look at stats and compare Hall of Famers and players of, yesteryear versus today and whatever, when we do these comparisons, we always like to not look at the postseason stats, what these players did on the big stage. And when you look at Fred McGriff, what he did in the playoffs, over a 300 average, over a 900 OPS, made multiple World Series, made multiple championship series. This guy performed on the biggest stages, and I don't think we can overlook that when it comes to a player's Hall of Fame candidacy.
Yeah, I think the postseason record is the postseason performances is what put Kirby Puckett into the Hall of Fame. Absolutely. I believe if he didn't win those 2 World Series with Minnesota, I don't think he would have gotten in. His stats are comparable to Don Mattingly's. Mm-hmm. There's an interesting thing that happens when people start to, there's these committee votes are always a little odd. There's some favoritisms that happen. When Harold Baines got in a couple of years ago, and it really kind of breaks my heart that Harold Baines has become the poster child for an undeserving Hall of Famer because he had a wonderful career. He was a really good player. He played for a long time. I just don't think anybody on the planet Earth thought he was a Hall of Famer. And then the committee included a bunch of people who were his former teammates and managers and seemed like a likable guy. And I think even he was like, wait, I'm in the Hall of Fame? Wait, what? So I think a lot of people will start to go, well, if Baines is in the Hall of Fame, why isn't Murphy in the Hall of Fame? That sort of thing. But none of that's valid with Fred McGriff. I thought he should have been in from the writers, and I'm thrilled that he's in now. I think he's, we're going to see what happens in the vote, and we're going to talk about who also was on the ballot who didn't get in, and maybe this is less about their on-field performance and more about what people think about them. But I wanted to stay positive at first. But it's a surefire bet that we are going to get negative pretty soon. If you're going to be betting, go to betonline.net. It's your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. I bet they had a line to bet on whether or not Fred McGriff was going to get into the Hall of Fame. Get the latest odds and trends for every professional and amateur league out there. From football to basketball, soccer, the World Cup, esports. I just found out what those were. We've got it all at betonline.net. If you love sports podcasts, and I'm guessing you do, you're listening to me right now, you can find those at BetOnline as well. You can find the podcast. Mom, you can't bet on the podcast. I just want to make sure you understood that. It's always the fastest and easy way to get your betting fix. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline is where the game starts. All right, let's talk a little bit about, you have the results in front of you. Go through who got what vote, if there's anything on that. Because I know we had Bell, Mattingly, Murphy, Clemens, Bonds, Schilling, and McGriff, and I think me, right? Who was the other one?
Oh, did you make it too, Sully? Hold on, I'm going to,
because my contributions were all after 1980.
Sorry, Sully. I was having Wi-Fi issues there, a little connectivity issues, but we're back here.
I thought I stunned you to silence. So what was the? Do you have the results of the ballots there?
The breakdown.
Yeah,
I got the breakdown for you, Sully. So, as we know, hold on. Let me take that lower third off for us.
Yeah, would you please?
I believe it's still showing BetOnline. But for the results, we got Fred McGriff, of course, unanimous. Then we got Don Mattingly. He came in at second with half the votes at 8. Kurt Schilling at 7. Dale Murphy at 6. And then fewer than 4 votes, you got Albert Bell, Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens, and Rafael Palmeiro. And we know you need 12 of 16 votes to make the Hall of Fame.
Yeah, I mean, it was... Yeah, no one else was really close. Palmeiro was the one I forgot. Again, I had a whole and by the way, I got a couple of nice notices for the podcast we did on Friday where I was honoring the late Gaylord Perry, who gleefully talked about cheating and therefore made me think, well, why do we allow some cheaters and not other cheaters? And why do we allow some PED users and not other PED users? Ortiz is in the Hall of Fame. Punch Rodriguez is in the Hall of Fame. We know they did PEDs. It's not the hardest mystery in the world to determine whether or not Bagwell took PEDs. Okay. And by the way, I think all three of them belong in the Hall of Fame. I think Ortiz, Rodriguez, and Bagwell are all Hall of Famers. Absolutely. It's just, come on. Well, two, we definitely know. So I think that a lot of this we're seeing Bonds and Clemens and Palmeiro are not out on the outside looking in because they were users, despite that being the narrative. That's not the case. Being a user did not keep Ortiz or Pudge Rodriguez out of the Hall of Fame. People liked Pudge Rodriguez. People liked David Ortiz. I don't know. You have a whole panel full of people voting for Bonds and Clemens, and less than 4 said yes, even though they all know those are two of the greatest of who ever played the game, even before they ballooned up. It's because they don't like them. They don't like those two dudes.
Yeah.
And that's the reason. People liked Fred McGriff. People liked Harold Baines. So, I mean, let's get down to brass tacks. That's what some of this boils down to.
Yeah, I don't like the politics game when it comes to the Hall of Fame, when it comes to baseball and some other sports. And for baseball, it's always the question of which steroid users are allowed to be in and which ones aren't, because we know guys like Mark McGwire and some other Hall of Fame PED users are in there while some guys aren't. And when you look at the Barry Bonds or Roger Clemens, they of course have great cases. And I've always made the point that I felt like anybody who took steroids pre-Mitch report, pre-2004, pre-crackdown should be in the Hall of Fame. The Barry Bonds, the Roger Clemens, put them in the Hall of Fame. If you were on the Mitchell report, I don't even care if you were. But post-Mitchell report, post-2004, post-2006, when baseball cared about steroids and there was these big punishments for steroids, if you're a guy like A-Rod that got caught in the mid-2000s and the 2010s with the biogenesis and everything like that, then I'm like, okay. Manny Ramirez, then I'm like, okay. Yeah, Manny Ramirez too. Those guys probably shouldn't be in the Hall of Fame. But a guy like Big Papi, who only showed up on the Mitchell report and never tested positive outside of that, I'm okay with him being in the Hall of Fame. So for me, pre-Mitchell report, steroid users, you're in. Post-2004, if you got caught, you should not be in the Hall of Fame, because that's when baseball really started to care about steroids.
Speaking of, we got Millard Thomas from Locked on Diamondbacks. I grew up a huge Red Sox fan of Pal Sully. Person who starred for both the Diamondbacks and the Red Sox is Curt Schilling. All just in a vacuum, Schilling's a no-brainer, especially, as you like to say, if you bring in what he did as a postseason pitcher. Remember, he won postseason MVPs with 2 different teams, and neither of those teams were the Red Sox. He won a postseason MVP series with Philadelphia and, of course, with Arizona, and then helped pitch the Red Sox to 2 World Series titles. His final game was winning a World Series game. We talk about politics. Look, I don't want to get into politics at all. I know I've kind of come to some grips with some things that, a lot of good old boy athletes are probably going to be players who, are probably not going to be very liberal in their politics, much like most actors and native people are not going to be conservative. I think the earlier we come to grips with something like that, the less offended we're going to be when you start hearing someone say something that you don't politically agree with. Now, Schilling went kind of above and beyond the call of duty on some of his political statements. And if you're trying to win over writers that maybe don't like pictures where people are talking about killing journalists, that being said, I'm going to show people have accused me of being biased. We all have biases. No human being. There's none of us are Vulcans. All of us have some biases here or there. You cannot get farther away politically or religiously between me and Curt Schilling. I believe Curt Schilling belongs in the Hall of Fame. And I would have voted him as a writer, and I would have voted for him in the committee. Even though I think he said despicable things and this and that, I'm sure there's a lot of people there who have said despicable things. And I have much more problem with people who we know were domestic abusers like Bobby Cox and Roberto Alomar than someone who says things that I don't agree with. You say things I don't agree with, Millard. I say things sometimes that I don't agree with, but this is not a hall of politics. And
yeah,
I
and
do, and this is
thank you
coming
haven't
from,
canceled me.
this is coming from me, who I am pretty left wing in my politics, and yet that's not enough for me to, people trying to edit him out of the history of the 2004 Red Sox. They aired some special about the Red Sox '04 series on, I forget, it was either ESPN or may have been, I don't remember, may have been MLB Network, where they basically cut out the bloody sock game when talking about 2004. What are you, out of your effing mind? Now, whether or not, I actually got into an argument with Kurt Schilling on Twitter about evolution, of which he is, let me just say, our positions on evolution, neither one of us are biologists. Well, let's just say we're not in line. Of course, I always put the ending of each time I made a point against what he was saying is, by the way, thank you very much for everything you did with the Red Sox. He has said things that I think are reprehensible and despicable and make me want to smack my forehead or do that Picard meme of putting my face palm. But he's a Hall of Fame pitcher. And I don't see anyone who is saying about the merits of his career could debate that.
Yeah, and look, the Kurt Schilling regular season stats, they're not like overwhelmingly dominant. It's not a regular season case for Kurt Schilling. It is all encompassing. When you take in the postseason, you have to bring in the playoff success because that's when Kurt Schilling took his game to another level. That's where you have all the big legacy moments. When you think of Kurt Schilling's career, it came in the postseason. And of course, we both don't agree with anything Kurt Schilling has said, but is it okay to separate the art from the artist here? Because I don't like to apply the character clause when it comes to the Hall of Fame, because guess what? If you want to apply the character clause, then we have to go back and retroactively take out everyone in the Hall of Fame who you said are domestic abusers. Go back and take out the first commissioner of Major League Baseball who wanted to keep the sport segregated. He was okay not allowing black players into the sport. He wanted to keep it segregated. We got guys like that in the MLB Hall of Fame, and Kurt Schilling is, maybe as bad as any of them. It depends on your spectrum of evilness, I guess so, when words versus actual violence. But if you're going to apply the character clause for Kurt Schilling, you have to go back and retroactively take out anybody in the Hall of Fame who's done bad, who's been a criminal, who's held up other port standards, like I just talked about, the first MLB commissioner and keeping baseball segregated. So for Kurt Schilling, he should be in the Hall of Fame because of what he did on the field. And of course, what he's done off the field. No one's supporting the words he said, but I think he should be a Hall of Famer, and we can't just apply this character clause whenever it feel like it's necessary.
By the way, I do want to say this. Schilling, his case would primarily be based on his postseason, but 3 times he was the Cy Young runner-up.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he had some tremendous postseasons. And when you take a look at, similar pitchers, some of the pitchers that he's similar to are those kind of borderline cases, like Hershiser, like Burley, like Kevin Brown, but also Verlander and Smoltz. When you take a look at comparing them there, look at the 2004 Red Sox are going to have no shortage of representation in the Hall of Fame when the dust settles. They already have Pedro Martinez and David Ortiz, and they're eventually going to have Terry Francona. But that being said, I it's a dangerous game, and this is coming from someone. And I think maybe for people who've complained about my biases, maybe I'm the person to say this, that I disagree with almost everything that comes out of his mouth, virtually everything he stands for. But what he did on the field is, I think, beyond question.
Yeah, and
I don't want to see it turn into, character clause. Like we're finding out about Clemens off the field is like, okay, this is some disqualification stuff. Okay, what maybe if some of this stuff is coming, if some of these allegations are coming through, that's big time. But I don't want to have not someone be in there just because they're bigoted or because I don't agree with them politically. There are already bigots and conservatives in the Hall of Fame right now.
Yeah, and like a quick test for me to determine if you're a Hall of Famer, if I go to your baseball reference and I see a sea of black, that means something is bolded. That means you led the league in that category. There's a lot of black when you go to the Kurt Schilling baseball reference page. So I think just by that, he's a MLB Hall of Famer. But Sully, was there anyone else on the contemporary ballot, of course, who didn't make it that you think should be in the MLB Hall of Fame?
Well, I mean, I heard thunder roll when Barry Bonds didn't get in because he was my dad's favorite player. And my dad was up above Rolling Thunder. I like players that had very big, strong peaks. Dale Murphy had a really great peak. And also, he was a guest on this show. I mean, so there's bias there. And I'd love to say I had a Hall of Famer on the show. Could not have been nicer, could not have been more gracious. He and Mattingly had very similar careers. Their peaks were right around the same time. They were the best players on that team and in the league around the same period of time. And for people my age, I mean, talk to Stacey Gotsulias. She keeps saying that if she had a son, she would have named him Mattingly. Actually, I think that's a name could work for a son or a daughter. But that for people our age, Mattingly was their guy. Murphy was their guy. If they didn't have such a drop off so fast. Like if they put in those great peaks and then just sort of coasted for a couple more, very good years, I think he would have had a much stronger case. I would have loved to see him get in. I understand why he didn't get in, but McGriff did, and tough to argue with it. Tough to argue with Fred McGriff.
Because I'm not too familiar with these careers in terms of like watching them play. All these guys were before my time. But from a Dale Murphy, I was surprised to not see him get in. Just because when you look at the profile, a 2-time MVP, like how many back-to-back MVPs do you not see in the Hall of Fame? 7-time All-Star, 5-time Gold Glover, 4-time Silver Slugger. And in the decade of the 1980s, he had the second most home runs during that time period behind only Mike Schmidt. For Don Mattingly, I see a little bit more of the case as to why he didn't get in. He won an MVP. He was really good for like 5 or 6 seasons. But by the time he was 29, his career was it was basically washed up by the time he was 30s. At least Dale Murphy was like a catcher his first few years, turned into transition to a Gold Glove center fielder, and then was pretty good and productive late into his 30s. I thought a guy like Dale Murphy might have made the Hall of Fame and not a guy like Don Mattingly. But I am shocked that no one else made it outside of a Fred McGriff. But how about Albert Bell? How do you feel about him? Do you have any thoughts?
I think his peak wasn't long enough. I think he was a very good player, and his peak was not long enough.
Okay, I was just looking at his stats because his 162 game average is 40 home runs, a 295 average, 930 OPS. They're monstrous.
Yeah, he was outstanding. I just don't think he did it for long enough.
And it felt like he could have won an MVP too if he didn't have so much beef with the media during.
They gave it to Mo Vaughn, and I'm the biggest Mo Vaughn fan you'll ever meet in your life. There's no way Mo Vaughn wasn't even the most valuable Red Sox that year. Tim Wakefield was the most valuable Red Sox that year. But hey, I digress. Hey, do what I think though. I think it's time to think about keeping our house safe. Millard, do you have any thoughts about keeping your house safe in this holiday season?
Yeah, there's only one security system I recommend, Sully. Do you know what it is?
I couldn't even guess.
SimpliSafe.
Oh,
yeah. Did you want me to do the
Sure, why don't you do that? Because I can't find that tab. So why don't you talk about SimpliSafe?
No worries. I'll talk about SimpliSafe. Let me just pull it up real quick because I know SimpliSafe is the only whole home security system that I recommend for the people because, listen, guys, you guys need to get SimpliSafe because we believe home should be where you and your family feel safest, especially over the holidays. This season, give yourself and your family the gift of peace and protection with the #1 rated home security system, SimpliSafe. And right now, SimpliSafe is offering Locked On Diamondbacks and Locked On MLB listeners 40% off a new security system. But don't put this off because here's why I love SimpliSafe. In an emergency, 24/7 professional monitoring agents use Fast Protect technology exclusive from SimpliSafe to capture critical evidence and verify the threat is real so you can get higher priority police response. SimpliSafe is a whole home security with advanced sensors for every room, window, and door, HD security cameras for inside and out, smarter ways to detect motion that alert you only when a threat is real, and even hazard sensors that detect fires, floods, and other threats to your home. 24/7 professional monitoring service costs less than $1 a day, less than half the price of a traditional home security system. With the top-rated SimpliSafe app, stay in complete control of your system, arm or disarm, unlock for a guest, access your cameras, or adjust settings anytime, anywhere. Don't miss your chance to save big on my favorite security system. Get 40% off any new system at simplisafe.com/lockedonmlb today. That's simplisafe.com/lockedonmlb. There's no safe like SimpliSafe.
Hey, let's talk about the other big piece of news that came out in the last few days. That collectives, you heard a scream from above, which was my dad, but now came the scream from Flushing. Jacob deGrom, beloved ace of the New York Metropolitans, signed how many years? 5 years?
I think like
Texas
6.
Rangers. Was it 6?
I got to double check.
It was a lot. It was many, many years.
A lot of money
that he signed. And
You're right.
Met fan, like I got a text from my cousin Dave, who's a rabid Met fan. Danielle Sepulveda, whose name I always mispronounce. I'm sorry, Danielle. But probably the biggest Met fan I know. You would have thought there was a death in her family if you read her Twitter feed. Look, I don't mean to be cold-hearted here, but yes, emotionally, it's going to stink to see Jacob deGrom in another uniform if you're a Mets fan. But let's remember one thing here. Let's just be real. DeGrom's a great pitcher, okay? DeGrom's won back-to-back Cy Young Awards. When DeGrom is on the mound, he's one of the 3 or 4 best pitchers in all of baseball. I think we can all say that.
Mm-hmm.
He made 11 starts last year. 11. He made 15 starts the year before. An ace, you'd like to have between 25 to 30 starts a year. He's given them 26 starts over the last 2 years. Okay? The gigantic chunks where DeGrom was, when Jacob comes back, he'll be rested. He's going to be, he is right now, according to baseballreference.com, he's going to turn 35 in June.
Whew.
35. Because we have these images of these pitchers coming up as young superstars, we forget the fact he's pitched for 9 years. 9. Which is also German for no. And again, I totally understand why the Mets would have signed him, but you and I both know that there is a real possibility that he's going to break down in Texas. Could he come back and be a Justin Verlander reclamation project? Yes. They brought in Bruce Bochy to manage, who has a great reputation of working with pitchers. Absolutely. But this is an injury-prone pitcher who the Mets have done everything except put him in a bubble to prevent him from getting injured, and he still gets injured all the time. And so the idea that the Mets are going to lose out on him, well, they lost out on him for all but 11 games last year.
Yeah.
Again, I'm not belittling him. When he's on the mound, he's great. But he's almost never on the mound.
Yeah, that's an issue. They say the best ability is availability. And for the Mets, I get it. It's a lot of money. It's a lot of years. And Jacob deGrom is a huge health risk. And it just sucks for that fan base because Jacob deGrom is such a historic figure, such a big figure in Mets lore, literally one of the most historic pitchers we've seen in baseball of the last 20 years. And the idea of someone like that walking when the Mets just got this new owner who's willing to spend money on pretty much every MLB superstar, but he let someone of deGrom's caliber, albeit we know the risk, but he still let him walk. It is shocking for Mets fans. And now you look at that Mets rotation, something that was a strength. You looked at the depth of that rotation last year. It was their strength, but now deGrom's gone. Chris Bassett's a free agent. Taijuan Walker's a free agent. All of a sudden, it's Max Scherzer. It's David Peterson, Carlos Carrasco. Still a pretty good rotation, but now it's who are they going to go after next? The Mets feel like these sharks in the water just circling around these big-time free agents that are still available. The Justin Verlanders, that seems to be maybe the Mets' next big target in free agency. Someone like Carlos Rodon, a little bit younger, strikeout artist too. But I think the most fun narrative would be for the Mets to go after Justin Verlander just because we get the reunion of Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander together once again.
If you asked me a week ago, I would have said that Verlander, it was a lock to go back to Houston. Now I think both Los Angeles and the two New York teams, and for, the Angels should be playing footsie with them too. But I think both New York teams and the Dodgers should be salivating to bring him in, and I think he will probably leave the Astros. It wouldn't surprise me. I think maybe the signing of Abreu was, well, we got to start doing something to move on. The Astros have a ton of pitchers. And remember, Verlander didn't pitch in 2021 when they went to the World Series. This was a comeback season for him. And he's older than deGrom, of course. But I think Verlander has at least one more very good season. And I think Scherzer does as well. As for Texas, for all my talk about with this, signing to a long-term deal may not be the right thing, I am reminded of a Red Sox Hall of Famer from 2004 who did in fact sign with the Mets, who was Pedro Martinez, my single favorite player in the history of baseball. When he signed with the Mets after the 2004 World Series, he gave them one very good season, and then he kind of felt the injuries caught up. We all knew he was going to break down. But that acquisition of Martinez kind of changed the culture a little bit in Metdom. And they got to within one swing of the World Series the next year. I wonder if bringing in a deGrom, even if it's just for the first year or so, to sort of change around the mindset to say, hey, folks, we're going to try this. We're going to make a run at the Astros. The management's behind us. They brought in Bochy. They brought in deGrom. Maybe that psychological factor of the Rangers are here to play is as important as anything that you find as a number on baseballreference.com, the single race website.
Yeah, for the Rangers, here's the thing. I love the philosophy. I love the strategy. I love the idea of going out there in free agency and spending the money on stars. They did it last year with the Corey Seagers, the Marcus Siemens. They signed a John Gray too. I'm not that big. I'm not that big of a John Gray guy. But then they went out there and got Jacob deGrom this year. I love the philosophy of throwing money at big-time free agents and talent because you need talented players on your roster to make real postseason runs. But I don't think the Rangers were in the place where they should have gone after these big-time free agents because they were basically starting at square one when you look at their team last offseason. That is one of the worst rosters in baseball entering last year's offseason, and all they did was basically throw like the old adage, put some makeup on a pig, because this roster still isn't very good. They're still going to have so many holes around all this big time money that they now tied up the middle and into a Jacob deGrom. I just don't think it's going to really push them too far into the postseason. Like, I would have understand making these moves if you're the Rangers, if you weren't that far away from competing, if you had a roster like, say, the D-backs, we have a whole bunch of young talent in your lineup. You got a Zach Gallen, you got a Merrill Kelly as well. Now you're like, okay, we're adding the Corey Seagers and the Marcus Simeons and the Jacob deGroms to that roster. Now, if you add, if you take the D-backs team from last year and add those three stars to it, now you're looking at a real World Series roster. Even a team like the Miami Marlins with that pitching staff, they got Jazz, but they really need offensive players. If you threw a Corey Seager and a Marcus Semien on that team, then Jacob deGrom, you're looking at that team as a World Series roster. But for this Texas Rangers team, where they were starting from last year, they were nowhere near competing. They were years away. They just needed to add pieces. They needed some quality young talent. They've been trying to rebuild through the draft. It wasn't working out for them. So they were like, let's go out there and spend some money in free agency. But the problem was they were so far and deep into their rebuilding process. Signing these star free agents, I just don't think is going to move the needle that much for them. They're going to be a borderline 500 team, but I just don't see how they're really going to be able to push themselves into playoff contention. I think it's just going to be a few more years where the Rangers just kind of muddling around 500. They got a lot of money locked up into these stars, and they're going to be banking a lot on these stars because, like we're talking about Jacob deGrom as a health risk, like if he doesn't pay off and if he's not there on the field every day making 30 starts a season, like this could be a disaster for the Rangers, because I love the idea of spending money, but I don't like how they started their team with their team building from last offseason and just basically how they built it. I love the idea of throwing money at stars, but I don't think they were the right team to start doing it.
Well, you're the right guy to be doing a podcast with every Monday. So, hey, Millard Thomas, thanks so much for being here, as you always are every Monday, talking Hall of Fame and talking deGrom. Tell people where they can follow your great show.
You can follow me on Twitter at CreatorThomas24 for my personal account. Look up Locked On Diamondbacks on both Twitter and Instagram for the podcast handle. We're on all your streaming platforms, and we're on YouTube, so please hit subscribe on the Locked On Diamondbacks YouTube channel.
And thanks so much for making Locked On MLB your first listen. For your next listen, obviously make it Locked On Diamondbacks. But then check out Locked On Sports Today podcast, the biggest stories of the day, plus instant reaction, big game recaps, and the take of the day. Available on the Odyssey app, YouTube, or wherever you get podcasts. I am your co-host, normally the host of Locked On MLB. My name is Paul Francis Sullivan. You can follow us at Locked On MLB Pods on Twitter and Instagram. And I'm your pal Sully. I'm at Sully Baseball on Twitter, Sully Baseball Podcast and Instagram. Talking about how they pick these Hall of Famers. This has been the Locked On MLB, Locked On Diamondbacks crossover. He's Millard Thomas. I'm Sully. I'm going to have some dinner. Time to fist pump.